Well, we're in Samuel, finished up Saul and how David came into being the king and so forth. And now we're going to talk about David specifically, the righteous standards that were set by David. But we're also going to talk about the three major covenants that we've studied so far. We'll be reading from 2 Samuel chapter 7, Psalms 89, and Psalms 2. 2 Samuel 7 is where Nathan comes to David and gives him the promise of his throne being forever. And Psalms 89 and Psalms 2 are prayers that David made, accepting and the responsibility that God has placed upon him. In 2 Samuel 7, there's going to be 6 elements and, of course, the prayers. So let's begin by looking at the 3 major covenants. I think it's important that we go back and sometimes review earlier covenants, promises that God has made, and we can see the nature of God then. He keeps his promises, and it's important that we do this from time to time. Around 2000 BC, Abraham was given a promise. In Genesis 12, we read that 7 promises to Abraham. Anybody want to kind of repeat what some of those are? Do you remember what they were? Pardon? There was a land promise in there, yes. He'd give them the land.
Descendants.
Pardon?
Descendants.
Okay. Well, specifically in Genesis 12, he says he'll make him a great nation. That he would, and today we know that salvation was promised to everyone, all peoples, through Abraham. God said that he would bless him, that he make a great name for him. He would bless those who bless him. Whoever curses you, he will curse. And all peoples of the earth will be blessed through him. That's the basic 7 promises that God made to Abraham there in Genesis 12. Then around 1500 BC, we have the Mosaic Law. Now that's not a promise, that's a law. So there's a little difference between a promise and a law. But within the Mosaic Law, we have the 10 Commandments. We have laws about idols and altars. We have rules about Hebrew servants, personal injuries, protection of property, law of justice and mercy, and a covenant is confirmed that the Israelites would be his people. There's probably a lot more than just that. I didn't have time to read all 5 chapters and try to identify everything, but that's a good basic start there. And then about 1000 BC, 500 years later, David is made king. And today we're going to talk specifically about the promises made to David in 2 Samuel. But let's compare these 3 covenants. Abraham was one that was made to an individual, one person. Where the Mosaic Law was a national covenant to the peoples, and David, of course, was an individual. Abraham's covenant is called a promise, and David's covenant was called a promise, but there's no such promise with the Israelite Mosaic Law. Abraham was unilateral. And what does that mean? What does unilateral mean?
Done single-handedly by God.
True. But it's also a one-sided promise. Abraham didn't have to do anything. He wasn't required to do anything. God just promised him because he was a godly, God-fearing man. The Mosaic Law was a bilateral. There was talk between the two, between God and his chosen people. David is also a unilateral because David didn't have to do anything either. We know that David was a man after God's own heart. God recognized him as being faithful and true, and so God made the promise to him. Here's some other things about these three laws that are similar or not similar. Abraham's promise was irrevocable. God said he'd never take it away. But the same thing is true about David. His promise was irrevocable. But we know that the Mosaic Law was revocable. Even the New Testament law came into effect, the law of Jesus Christ. This is the important part. These two, Abraham and David's, was a permanent. God keeps his promises. God never made any changes to those promises. God told both Abraham and David what their lineage would be like, what their life would be like. But we know the Mosaic Law was temporary. Genesis 12, there's more to it than just the 7 things I mentioned earlier. There was as a nation, the land, and the seed. The promise to David was specific, seed identified. So at the time of the promise to Abraham, we didn't know who would eventually be the Messiah, from what tribe or what peoples, whatever, because the nation hadn't really been formed yet. But when we got to the cross, we know that Jesus was the final seed in that promise. Abraham, generic promise of salvation. Oh, come on. Why can't I get rid of that? And where's my cursor at? Pardon?
It's flying all over. We see it.
I'm not seeing it. So.
It's gone now.
There we go. But see, I'm not seeing it on the screen here.
Maybe use the arrow key.
Tech specialist?
Use your arrow keys.
Pardon?
Use the arrow keys.
See, I'm trying to get rid of, I have a blue box in here I'm trying to get rid of, Pat. Tech specialist. Tech specialist. How do I get rid of that box?
You say.
I want to,
Remind me tomorrow.
that's not,
It's not.
and you can't see it,
Touch screen.
so you can't see that.
You're right. You can't see it. Yeah, the arrow's
escape.
right there, but it's not.
There we go, escape. Still can't see it. Oh, there it is.
There it is. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's continue. Thank you.
Yeah.
At this point, thank you, Chase. Didn't think about escape. There are 6 elements to the promise to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Nathan comes to David and tells him what God wants him to do or what God promises to him. He's going to build a house, a dynasty, as we say. The scripture reference there is 2 Samuel 7:13. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. In Genesis 49, verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. What's that last reference to? Jesus Christ? Yeah. Okay, his seed will be an everlasting kingdom in 7:12. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offering to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So probably the main part of David's, the promise of David was that his throne would last forever. And we'll see also that Jesus is part of that lineage of the seed of David as well. He's got an everlasting throne. Scepter will not depart from Judah. His seed would build God's house. 2 Samuel 7:12 and 13. Would someone look up 1 Timothy 3:15? When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors. All right, right place, yeah. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom, and your throne of his kingdom will last forever. What's 1 Timothy 3:15 say? Who has that?
But if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourselves in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth.
Okay. So the house of God, of course, was originally built by the ancestors. We know specifically Solomon. His seed, a father-son relationship, 7:14. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. We see here in this promise that God will use other people, other nations, to keep his people, his seed, in line. And as we continue our study, we're going to study the lost tribes, if you will, the 10 that left and went to the north kind of thing. That's in the future of our studies here. Finally, the sixth one, it's irrevocable. I will be his father, he'll be my son. When he goes wrong, I will punish him. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So those are the 6 specific items of the promise to David. When I first set this all up, I thought I was reading God speaking to David, but it's not. It's Nathan. God is speaking through the prophet Nathan to David. David, of course, goes on in his life being a man of prayer and music and other talents and so forth. He wrote a lot of the Psalms, as we know. And Psalms 89, we know that is one of the Psalms that David wrote. And in verse 14, we have justice and judgment are the habitation of thy throne. Mercy and truth shall go before thy face. Also, we have in verse 19 of 89, once you spoke in a vision to your faithful people, you said, I have bestowed strength on a warrior. I have raised up a young man from among the people. These are just some of the references in David's prayer. Now we're going to look at 27 through 37, Do I have a volunteer to read that part of Psalms 89? Okay.
27 through 37. I also shall make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. My loving kindness I will keep for him forever, and my covenant shall be confirmed to him. So I will establish his descendants forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. If his sons forsake my law and do not walk in my judgments, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter the utterance of my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His descendants shall endure forever, and his throne is the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, and the witness in the sky is faithful.
Yeah. So David was considered a faithful witness. Are we not considered faithful witnesses today? Verse 37 says, "It will be established forever like the moon, the faithful witness in the sky." John 1:18, I thought that was rather interesting. Once you spoke in a vision to your faithful people, you said, I have bestowed strength on a warrior. I have raised up a young man from among the people. You know, sometimes we read in the scriptures of Old Testament people who are said to have seen God. We can go to Exodus 24, 9 through 11. But not the fullness of his glory. But we are told that no one can see God and live. We know when Moses came down from the mountain, his face shone very bright, and the people wanted him to hide his face and so forth. Therefore, since no human being can see God as he really is, those who saw God saw him in a form he took on himself temporarily for the occasion. Now we know what God looks like, do we not? In what person do we know that what God looks like? Jesus. Right. Jesus came down in the flesh. So the question we want to ask is, are you a faithful witness? I believe that's what number one job we have as Christians is to seek and save the lost. We are to be that bright and shining light to the rest of the world. And I think here at Kirkland, we do a good job of that. We probably could do better, but we do a good job of that. Any comments or questions about being a faithful witness? Okay. The prophets referred to this promise when predicting the coming deliverance of Israel. Since his name is not known yet at this time, the prophets didn't know what to call him. They promised Messiah. He is simply called David, or the seed of David, which is the fulfillment of the promised Messiah. But we have a lot of references in the Old Testament to the seed of David or the son of David. For example, Isaiah 11:1, and we're all familiar with Isaiah 53. But 11:1 says, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit." And of course, Jesse being the father of David. This is a direct reference to David. Jeremiah 23:5 and 6. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will live in safety. This is the name by which he will be called, the Lord, our righteous Savior." Jesus had that name. Jesus was called that. And Jeremiah 33, Ezekiel 34:23 through 24. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. The Lord will be their God, and my servant David will be a prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. My servant David shall be king over them. Now, this is where I got into some concerns when I was trying to prepare for this. Basis of the Jewish doctrine of the transmigration of souls. This the Jews took literally, but I couldn't find any good descriptions. What is the transmigration of soul? Can someone help me out here? What is the transmigration of souls? And I didn't have a chance to talk to Brent about it. So I'm going to have to just, we can bring that up next week and ask him to explain what that means. Yeah.
Is that where the Jews feel like if you're a very good person and you pass away, you come back as somebody else?
It could mean that. Like I said, I really don't know. Anybody got a dictionary, Bible dictionary or something? I've never heard that before. This was the first time I saw it in any study, so that's a good question for Brent next week, in my opinion, anyway.
That the soul is reborn in one or more successive mortal bodies, a form of reincarnation, or composition of for orchestras, chorus, children's.
Coming back as other people or something? Yeah.
Reincarnation.
Good. If you follow the law and you're good, you get to come back. And if it's part of the Jewish.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't. And I'm sorry, I couldn't find any information. I did look up transmigration of souls on the internet, and it just gave me some weird stuff that I didn't want to consider. I'm sorry. Yes, Anil?
Yeah, it's the concept of reincarnation.
Uh-huh.
Reincarnation, so people believe that they come back after they die, they come back in a different form or different person. They have so many lives until they attain the eternity. So you may come back as frog or and 1 billion people believe that. That's India.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's kind of what I read, and why would the Jews take this literally? I don't know. But, throughout the Jewish literature and so forth, we know that they mention the seed of their parents or their grandparents or whatever, and that could be part of what it means too. But thank you, Anil. Any other comments? Okay. The New Testament writers understood New Testament events were a fulfillment of these things, and we know that there's many, many, many references or predictions of the Messiah in the Old Testament, and they've all been fulfilled in Jesus in the New Testament. So we have that record to go by. But here's some references that the New Testament writers did or say about this. Why does the New Testament begin with Matthew 1:1? Anybody want to look that up and try to explain why the New Testament begins with Matthew 1:1? Go ahead, Pat.
Matthew was written to the Jewish people.
Correct.
And the Jewish people were looking for the Messiah through the lineage of David, so this establishes that lineage.
Yeah, Matthew 1:1 references the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Ties that all together for the Jews. We know that the four Gospels were written to 4 different audiences, if you will. Matthew to the Jews. Now we're studying Mark in Sunday morning. And Matthew presents Jesus as the Messiah, the promised descendant of King David, who would bring God's kingdom to earth and establish a time of peace and justice. Matthew quotes the Old Testament extensively and places specific emphasis on Jesus' fulfillment of the prophecies, which would have been important to the Jewish audience. So that's a good way to start the New Testament, obviously. Mary understood the significance of Jesus and his birth as well. In Luke 1:31 and 33, the angel speaking to Mary says, "You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord will give him the throne of his father David." Now, is that kind of transmigrating too? I don't know. "And he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His throne will never end." So Mary understood the significance of Jesus' birth. And Paul emphasized in his preaching that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of David. This says 17 to 23, but I think the idea begins in 16. Standing up, Paul motioned with his hand and said, "Fellow Israelites, and you Gentiles who worship God, and listen to me." Paul was the messenger to the Gentiles. "The God of the people of Israel chose our ancestors. He made the people prosper during their stay in Egypt. With mighty power, he led them out of that country. For about 40 years, he endured their conduct in the wilderness." What's that a reference to? Yeah. And overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, giving their land to his people as their inheritance. All this took about 450 years. They were in captivity for about 410 years, and they wandered for, okay? After this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. After removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, "I have found David, son of Jesse, after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do." And in verse 23 it says, "From man's descendants God has brought to Israel the Savior Jesus as he promised." So we have a tie here between the covenants, the 3 covenants that God had made with the Israelites, and then the promise to David continues through generation and generation until we get down to the New Testament in the birth of Jesus. And that is God's promise to the descendants of Israel. But it's also a promise to us. Are there any questions about these 3 covenants? Anything in here you want to review further? I think I went pretty fast, and I'm kind of sorry for that, but any discussions? Hope you did your homework. Have questions or whatever. Any comments? I didn't know this was going to go so fast, to tell you the truth. I really didn't. But here's the good news. Brent will be back next week. That's the good news.
Can we go back to 2 Samuel 7?
Yeah.
And reference 12 through 16, that's actually talking about Jesus.
Pardon?
It's actually talking about Jesus when he says, my version says, when he becomes sin, I will punish him with the rod of men and the lashes of the sun. That's about he's prophesying his death at the hand of men. And the sin is actually man's sin, not Jesus' sin.
Right.
Just wanted to put that.
Okay. That's a good point. That's a good point.
I have a question.
Yes. Boy, that light is bright coming through that window.
In verse 2,
I don't know how he does that.
it talks about David asking to build. He says, "I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God's dwelling inside tent curtains."
Right.
It sounds like it was David's idea to build the house, not God's.
Well, I think God has taken that idea from him and kind of accepted it as his idea, but he's not going to let David actually build it. David gathered the material. Solomon actually built it. We know that from the scriptures. But David being a man after God's own heart, there's no reason why God wouldn't take credit for that as well, giving that to David. But we know that David didn't get to build it. Any other comment? Yes.
Just a question. You might not know the answer.
Okay.
But so David has this idea to build a house for God.
He mentions the idea, yes.
Sorry?
He mentions the idea.
He mentions it. And he asks Nathan about it. And verse 3, Nathan says, go ahead and do what you have in your mind, for the Lord is with you. But then that night, God tells him, does his blessings, but then tells him, David, you're not going to build it.
Well, that night, God spoke to Nathan to speak to David, and we know at the end of that section there, Nathan tells David he's not going to be the one to build it.
Yes, so verse 3, when Nathan tells David to do it, do you think Nathan misspoke there? Or, like, he hadn't talked to God yet, and he was telling him his opinion?
I don't think so. I think the fact that David and God were so close and so one in each other kind of thing that Nathan knew that David was God's chosen one, and I just believe that. Go ahead, Pat. She has a different Bible.
My reference says that here Nathan was speaking to David as a friend, not as a prophet. Nathan did not preface his remarks with "Thus saith the Lord" or "Thus saith God." He was speaking as just a person.
That could be. That could be a reason. Sometimes you have to, when you're talking to people, you might want to preface what you're going to say so they understand where you're coming from, whether you're coming from a position of authority or you're coming from a position of a friend on the side, whatever it might be.
Verse 17 actually says Nathan told David all the words of God.
Yeah.
Everything Nathan had heard and seen from God. That was exactly what Nathan told him. So when he's being a prophet, it's actually clarified that he's speaking as prophet. Where verse 3, nothing clarifies that. That's the end of God.
Yeah.
Although in my version it says, go do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. So that tells me that God's all for it.
Yeah. God is for it.
That's like any house we build, we come up with the idea first, right? That doesn't mean we're physically going to build it.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the makings. So I think this is kind of what is going on here. It's the start.
It's part of that initial promise.
He's not necessarily going to build it.
Well, Nathan tells him he's not going to build it
Yeah,
eventually, yeah.
but he started the idea.
Yeah. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. He wanted to do it. He had it in his heart to do it. I don't recall at what point in David's life this is happening. Is it after all these battles that he's been in and then he's a man of war too or something? I didn't prepare that much more than what Brent had given me. But, it's interesting that we have those kind of questions, and just continue reading the Bible and God will answer them, right?
It's explained in 1 Kings chapter 8. Solomon is now the king, and he describes what went on. And he said, now it was in the heart of my father David to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, because it was in your heart to build the house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son. So he's explaining that it was in his heart. He wanted to do it,
Yes. That's important.
Nathan, once he got the whole, and he communicated with the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
and answer was,
Yep.
not you,
Yeah.
but your son. So,
And Todd, you have a comment?
Can you go back to that slide that had that word,
A slide for where?
a couple back? Yeah, the reincarnation or whatever it was.
Further?
Yeah, right there, keep going, no, don't go back, the text at the bottom that you had.
Go forward.
The way I think of this, maybe maybe Brent thinking it is, when Jesus asked his apostles or disciples at the time, who men say that I am, they all referred to people that had gone. Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, and some of the prophets. So maybe that's what he's kind of thinking of here in this case, as far as this word transmigration of souls. I don't know.
Well, the Jewish doctrine of transmigration of soul maybe took this very literally, like you said. And we have lots of references where a few generations later, they're talking as if there's just one generation later, too, because they skip some generations there in family trees and so forth. And I think it's interesting that in the first four books, or the first three books, we have those three genealogies, and they're just all a little bit different. They're just a little bit different. But Matthew was important to be the first one because of its reference to the Jews, what the Jews were looking for and so forth.
Yeah, and that was really important to them because they wanted to see that lineage. I mean, that was very meaningful to them at that time.
Mm-hmm. Next week, if you have your outline here, David's sin with Bathsheba. So your homework, 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. I appreciate your comments that you have. I know I'm about 5 minutes early here. We'll get a chance to visit a little bit. That's all I have today.